You found DC Investing. I have reached financial independence, and I'm talking about topics that might help others reach financial independence. And I heard a really interesting statement recently that kind of took me aback for a minute. I really had to uh, ponder on it, think about it for a minute, and wanted to look up some data and found that, I think it's true. And the thing that caught me off guard was they said, even if mortgage rates were 0%, you still couldn't afford a house. Um, Now, it's not necessarily my generation. I'm Gen X, have a house, but it's more the new generation that's having the difficulty here. And so, as an experiment, I looked up um, some information in my own area, and I do think it's true. So, the average house in the Salt Lake City area, which I live in, goes for about $545,000. Now, there's some that are a little lower than that, some that are definitely over that, but they're just, the average house price is $545,000. So if you use a mortgage calculator, you enter that as the principal amount, and you take the interest rate down to next to nothing. I think I put 0.001%. It means basically over the next 30 years, you're paying principal only. And for that amount, what I came up with is $18,200 a year of payments where you're just paying principal only. And that turns out to be a monthly payment of about $1,500 a month. So that's just no interest, just principal payments only. And one of the rules of thumb that exists out there is that your mortgage payment shouldn't be more than 28% of your overall income. So if you take that $18,000 and divide it by 28, that tells you that you need an income of $65,000 a year to afford that home. Now, they also had a statistic that said your total debt shouldn't be more than 36% of your income. So if you have student loans that put you over that mark, or if you have a car payment or credit card debt or anything else, can throw that out of whack too. But basically, your as long as your total debt was below 36%, then your housing debt should only be 28%. So that's a $65,000 a year salary that you need in order to pay the mortgage rate. And then for fun, I looked up, well, what is the average salary of an individual in Salt Lake City? And turns out it's about $61,000. So right off, there it is. You need $65,000 to afford a house with no interest, but the average person makes $61,000. So it's true. Even if the mortgage rate was 0%, you could not afford to buy that house, the standard average house with the standard average salary. So that just kind of shows, the sadness of how inflation has impacted our society, and how much out of balance everything is right now. Now, most folks that do buy houses, they have two income households where both members of the couple have to work in order to to pay for housing, but then it's still a stretch. So, I kind of looked, you can get a mortgage loan for about 6.5%. So that same house that's $545,000, enter that information into a mortgage calculator. Your yearly mortgage payment is $41,000, and that gives you a monthly payment of about $3,400. So that's kind of just the standard mortgage that's out there right now. And so if you do that same calculation and you take your $41,000 a year, divide it by 28%, that means you have to either, a single person has to have a salary of $147,000 in order to afford that house by themselves, or the couple together needs to have that income of $147,000. Now, that's a pretty steep income rate for somebody in the Salt Lake City area. There are some jobs that do pay that, particularly in the technology fields and whatnot, but it's usually not an entry level position. It's more of a, you got to grow into that position. So, I feel for, I've got kids that are kind of setting out right now, and I'm like, how are they going to buy a house? And my wife and I have had conversations like, we may need to help them get into a house. We might need to move and let one of the kids move into one of our houses, or if parents pass away, we need to hang on to these houses just so the kids can have a place to live. So that's kind of the state of where it is. It's really getting difficult out there, and even with mortgage rates of 0%, the average salary from a single person is not enough to pay for that house. And if you have two people with the average salary of $61,000, that turns into just over $120,000 a year. When you add interest, normal interest into a mortgage, you make $120,000 a year, but it costs, to be safe, you need $147,000 a year to be able to afford that mortgage. It's just not going to work. So, kind of thinking about what can be done about this. Um, you know, I looked up the price to rent in the Salt Lake area, and it was quite a bit lower. For a 3-bedroom house, I think the monthly payment was about, on average, $2,500. For a 4-bedroom house, it was just under $3,000. So if you were planning on owning a house and paying mortgage payments, rent is actually cheaper right now. So like, let's say you could make do with a 3-bedroom house for $2,500 a month. A mortgage would have been $3,500. Well, that's $1,000 difference per month. So instead of just spending the money, to practice trying to afford the house, you can try to save that extra $1,000 a month and then invest it. So in a year's time, that means you would have saved up $12,000. And then you invest it in something that has a good return. I like pipeline stocks, and there's an ETF called MLPA that has about a 7.5% dividend yield. So if you bought something like that, you're going to get a yield of 7.5% every year. So that $12,000 the first year will grow a little bit. Second year it'll grow. You'd end up with $24,000. Third year it'll grow. And if it keeps compounding, before long, you're able to make quite a sizable down payment on a house, which gets you a potentially lower interest rate and a smaller payment. So eventually, after saving for a few years, your down payment could get large enough to make the difference, so that when you do a mortgage amortization, since your principal balance goes down a little bit, then your monthly payment is also down. You could also save in the S&P 500. A lot of people like the ticker VOO. The V stands for the Roman number 5, and then the OO is 100. So VOO, that's the S&P 500. I looked, and it's up 9.53% this year. So, if you'd been investing in the S&P 500, your funds could have grown. So saving and investing is one method that slowly over time you can make up for this difference. And that just kind of taking the arbitrage between what it costs to rent versus what it costs to buy. And, it might take 5 years, it might take 10 years as you're slowly saving up in order to afford a house someday. Eventually you'll get there, as long as you're willing to not spend the money, save it up, invest the difference, let it grow. Eventually you'll get there. Now, on the flip side, if the average person cannot afford the average house, eventually the system will run out of buyers. There's enough older folks that are going to pass away. Younger folks need to be able to purchase those houses. If salaries are not high enough for the average person to purchase the average house, then one of two things has to happen. Either the price of houses has to come down, or wages have to go up in order for the average person to afford the average house. So, it looks like, as I look at the economy right now, house prices are getting a little iffy, and they may begin to drop. And I think that really needs to happen, because no one can afford a house right now. And if you sell out of one house to try to buy another house, you just can't do it, particularly if you have one location that has a 3.5% interest rate, and when you move, you need a 6.5% interest rate. That math doesn't work either. So folks that do have a house are trapped. They can't really move. You have to be able to sell a house in one area and afford a mortgage in another. So eventually, I think it just doesn't work, and house prices are going to have to fall, because the average person can't afford the average house. So I don't know how that'll end up. Things can stay wonky longer than we can stay solvent. So that's kind of an interesting thing. But things are not balanced right now. There's a lot of houses that are really expensive in markets where people working, the average job cannot afford them. Something has to break at some point. I got to think housing prices are going to come back down because you got to have a buyer for the house you're trying to sell. So anyhow, that's kind of the thought for today. Even if mortgage rates were zero, chances are you still couldn't afford a house. It's kind of unfortunate, but let me know what you guys think. Are you in the same situation? Are you trying to buy a house, not able to? Did you get a house but just barely? You know what it's like in your, what's your experience like, and what do you think is going to happen to our housing and mortgage rate environment? Be curious to know. Like, subscribe. Thanks so much.